Now, the last time we had a hung parliament, I was but a child. It was the early 1970s, the Lib Lab Pact, and the one thing I do remember from the time was that everyone felt very, very poor. Fast forward 30-odd years, and according to the official economic statistics, not much has changed. Now, Dr. Philip Booth, as well as being a member of the academic faculty here at Cass, is also the director of what was Margaret Thatcher's favourite think tank, the Institute for Economic Affairs. I asked him for an economist's take on a hung parliament.
Well, in the medium term, I suspect there are very few consequences. All the parties have pretty similar policies in terms of reducing government borrowing, their approach to taxation, although the details are different, and their approach to government spending. And I'm not sure that the markets are really confident that any of the parties have a credible plan for reducing borrowing as much as is needed in the medium term. It's possible that the markets might be hoping that the Conservative Party have a plan up their sleeve that they don't want to reveal to the electorate, and therefore the markets might be somewhat disappointed if there is a hung parliament. But certainly on face value, whichever party gets elected, there doesn't seem to be a credible medium-term plan to deal with government borrowing and government debt.
But if there's no consensus that any of the parties have got the answer, would a hung parliament actually be a good thing?
Well, there's a possibility that some degree of political consensus can achieve something that an individual party would not be able to achieve. And sometimes you get into a position where parties can do things that are counterintuitive, such as it can be easier for a left-wing party to reform the NHS sometimes than a more free market-oriented party. In that respect, it might be easier for a coalition to come up with a credible long-term plan for reducing government borrowing. I suppose one of the problems is that if there is a coalition between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, which perhaps looks most likely, they would struggle to agree, I think, on their tax plans and the extent to which government borrowing should be reduced by increasing taxes or reducing government spending.
So what is it that the market actually wants to see?
I think the markets want to see a considerable reduction in government borrowing in the medium term, and most importantly, a credible plan relatively quickly. So it doesn't really matter whether or not government borrowing is reduced quickly in the next 6 months, 9 months, a year, as long as there is a credible plan for reducing it over the next 5 years. I think that's what the markets really want to see. But also, it's almost inconceivable, given the level at which tax rates are currently, that government borrowing can be reduced by increasing taxes substantially. So I think the markets essentially want to see a plan for cutting government spending.
But that's the greatest political conundrum of all time, isn't it? You can't both cut taxes and increase spending.
It's not an impossible conundrum that can never happen. It's happened several times in the last generation. Governments have actually got relatively tough on government borrowing, even if not actually on government spending. And it's a question really of leadership and being able to sell the necessity to the electorate to reduce government borrowing, which I don't think any of the parties are already doing currently.
But in a hung parliament, it is going to be just that much more difficult to cut spending.
It probably is going to be harder to cut spending, but then again, sometimes in politics you do get these counterintuitive situations where it might be easier for a Liberal Democrat Party combined with a Conservative Party, somehow in government, to do something radical in welfare, and it might be, which is the main area of government spending, and the obvious place where you can get substantial cuts. Whereas if the Conservatives were to do that alone, in a situation where there was not a hung parliament, they would have all the opposition lined up against them, and it might be much more difficult, in fact, to maintain a consistent programme of making cuts, rather more difficult than if there are two parties in coalition. I'm not saying that a coalition or a hung parliament is the best outcome for cutting public spending, but it's not actually impossible that, counterintuitively, there may be some rather good outcomes from a hung parliament.
Of course, all the parties say they've got a clear programme laid out for what they would do in the event that they win the election. Are you saying that many people in the financial world don't take those claims seriously?
I think it's difficult to take it seriously. The Liberal Democrats have laid out a relatively clear programme, although I think their tax plans are pretty incoherent and going to be very difficult to implement. The Conservative Party and the Labour Party have really not laid out any clear plans at all. The Labour Party have essentially decided not to have a comprehensive spending review until after the election if they get into government, and the Conservative Party are more or less following. There are some little tidbits here and there which amount to the odd billion here and the odd billion there, such as the decision not to implement the national insurance increase, but there's very little that's been proposed to reduce substantially the structural deficit.
So in the days leading up to the election, what should we be looking for? What would be a good reason to vote for a particular party?
I think I think the electorate should be looking for a party which is honest about the scale of government borrowing and has clear proposals to reduce government borrowing in the medium term. I think it's unrealistic for any proposals which involve substantial tax increases to be effective, so that means essentially cutting government spending.
Dr. Philip Booth from the Institute for Economic Affairs, thank you very much.